Hi, my name is Angelo Lopez. I'm a Filipino American editorial cartoonist based in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I have a great pleasure today to speak to Trixie Beato. Is that right? Okay. Trixie is a faculty member at the Department of Political Science at Ateneo de Manila University. And today we'll be talking about the political situation in the Philippines. So thank you, Trixie, for taking the time to talk to this ignorant Filipino American. So thank you very much and stuff. How's the weather there?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me as well. Actually, the weather right now is a bit rainy in Manila. So there's actually no classes right now in Quezon City where I'm based.
Oh,
So quite rainy, but hopefully it'll let up.
oh, okay. Yeah, I hope so too. Okay. So let me ask you the first question and stuff. Could you just tell me a little bit about your work in political science at Ateneo de Manila University?
Yeah. So, yeah, I teach at the Department of Political Science in Ateneo. So I teach mostly first year students. So I teach classes such as Introduction to Political Science, as well as Philippine Politics and Governance. And I also handle a general education course or GE course for fourth year college students, which is all about politics, governance, and citizenship. Aside also from my work at Poli-Sci, I also I'm a research associate at the Institute of Philippine Culture. So that's where I do different field-based research projects on different topics such as community development, people's perceptions, community organizing, so different research, but all concerning usually social issues and marginalized communities.
Oh, that's cool. Are you finding your classes more popular now because in the past few years because of Duterte and Marcos or
Well, I wouldn't. I would definitely say that there's a lot more political science majors right now back than when I was a student. So my undergrad was actually political science in Ateneo as well. So
uh,
in our university, students are blocked according to their major, and we were
oh,
definitely less compared to how many students there are now. And I think. I don't know. I suppose that's also in part because of the political climate in the country, but I definitely say one definite change that I've observed, at least in comparison to my cohort of students, is that um, because of the shift, perhaps, in education, the K to 12, and in the introduction of 2 more years to the students, what do you call this? Tertiary secondary education, they come into university with a stronger sense of politics and why they're interested. So, for example, um, in comparison to when I was a first freshman in college, a lot of my students now are they come into college with a stronger grasp on their principles, their ideological stances, if any. They have stronger or a more keen awareness of what's happening in the country, at least in comparison, I think, to when I was an undergraduate student. Yeah.
oh, okay. So they seem more passionate.
Yeah, definitely. And a
Oh,
lot of them, for a lot of them, their political awakening actually came in, if not in 2016, definitely the 2022 elections with the election of Bongbong Marcos into the presidency.
oh, were they Robredo fans, I guess, or
A good number of them are, some of them, but of course, in my classroom, and in any classroom, of course, whether that's for a first year, we were first year or fourth year students, we're open to people who have different political affiliations. So, for example, I've had students who are very strong supporters of Ping Lacson. I've had students who said that they were former Duterte supporters.
oh,
I think I would say that it's not just about uh, necessarily who they were aligned with, but rather their keen awareness that there are issues that confront the country. I think because for a lot of the students that I've handled, especially, they witnessed firsthand the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on their education, on
yeah,
their lives for 2 years at
yeah.
least.
Oh, that's cool. Well, that's not cool that he got affected by COVID and stuff, but I guess the isolation helped make him the issues more prevalent, I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely more pronounced in terms of what are the impacts, let's say, of the national government on their education. So for a lot of them, they finished high school. I had a good number of students who finished high school online, so they felt like they were really unprepared for college, or when they went into college, there was that sort of learning curve that they had to overcome in terms of what are the standards of face-to-face education. So my first, because I personally started teaching when the lockdowns were starting to wane. So I had no, what do you call this, basis of what it was like before that. So a lot
Um,
of my students did mention having a sort of adjustment period that they had to work through or work with.
so it was an adjustment for both you and the students.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry about that. Yeah, but I'm curious. I looked online. You occasionally host a show, right? Baka naman puede. Could you tell me about your show?
Yeah, so as part of my work at the Institute of Philippine Culture, let me know by the way if I become choppy. My internet I think is getting unstable.
Oh,
But as part of my work at the Institute of Philippine Culture, I sometimes get invited or I sometimes host a radio program, which is Baka Naman Pwede. So the Institute of Philippine Culture, it's a social science research organization of the Ateneo de Manila University. So it was started in the 1960s by Father Frank Lynch. And of course, the likes of Professor Mary Rosales have been affiliated with the
oh,
research institute. Yeah, that's how I met her. That's how we know each other.
oh,
And we proposed a radio program. It's a 1 hour radio program where we attempt to discuss social issues, current social issues, using a social science framework, and attempt to popularize really looking into issues using a social science lens. So, for example, one of our recent issues was an open conversation on the divorce bill and its implications
oh,
in the it's part of the IPC's effort towards convening different groups of people, whether they are from community organizations, non-government organizations, or the academe, in order to make sense of relevant issues of our time or of today, basically.
yeah. So it's sort of an educational tool, right?
Yeah, and we hope really to use it as a conversation starter. So it's 1 hour every week. We stream
Yeah,
on Facebook using the Radio Katipunan page. So it's from 2 to 3 p.m. So
yeah.
it's really it's meant as an educational tool, also as an opportunity to start conversation, since we do try to invite a diverse group of people. So not just from the academe, but also people from non-government organizations,
Mm.
people from communities or community partners, in order to kind of discuss or deepen knowledge about a particular topic.
Oh, okay. Now I'm curious. I just this clicked in my mind. Is Ateneo de Manila University, is it a Jesuit school? Is it Catholic
Yes,
or
it's a
okay?
Jesuit Catholic university.
So does the radio, there's a lot of, are you influenced by Catholic social teaching then in terms of, is that filtered through or is that apart from that?
Um, Definitely, Catholic social teaching, I think, has an impact on all aspects of what the university does. So, for example,
Oh,
Radio Katipunan definitely has, what do you call this? It of course, for example, streams masses,
yeah.
and we're very much linked to the wider Jesuit network, the wider Catholic radio programming network.
Cool.
I think, but if in terms of, let's say, the range of topics that we're allowed to discuss, we at the IPC have freedom to, explore these types of topics, especially. But I think that that owes a lot, of course, to the Jesuits themselves, who I think are relatively progressive or relatively open to these types of conversations.
Yeah, yeah. Now, if I want to find it, where can I find it? It's
Oh,
on Facebook, I guess, and then where is it all? I saw some on YouTube, right? Is it there?
Yes, so it does get streamed on YouTube as well through the Ateneo de Manila University YouTube page. But I think the easiest way is to, well, if you like the Institute of Philippine Culture Facebook page, it streams there every Thursday, 2 to 3 p.m.
No.
Manila time, Philippine time. But it also streams on the Radio Katipunan Facebook page. Or if you're ever in the Philippines, I think if you pass by specifically in front of our university, you'll be able to hear it on the radio.
It's on a loudspeaker?
No, it's I think there's a station, but it's a short range station.
Oh, okay. Okay. That must be cool. You must
It
have
may-
fans.
No, well, if only in so far as what do you call this?
Oh, okay.
if only as if only in so far as what do you call this? Uh, the our community partners that we try to give platforms to.
Oh, okay. 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 Now, I'm curious about something. As a political cartoonist, I'm very interested in learning more. I've been reading about the recent political split between Bongbong Marcos and Sara Duterte. Um, what are the political differences between them, and what are the ramifications of that split on the wider Philippine political scene?
Or would it be okay if you repeated your first question?
Oh yeah, sure. It's just what are the political differences between them, if any? Why is there a split?
Well, I think that a lot of actually maybe our call actually comes at a very interesting time. So yesterday, August 27th, there was a very headlines were made because during the budget hearing of the Office of the Vice President, Vice President Duterte, um, essentially did not want to answer questions from Congress
Yeah.
about the budget. I don't know if you've been able to read the headlines, but essentially she was refusing to answer questions for about 2 to 3 hours straight, to the point of
Um,
actually being quite combative, I would say, to the different members of House present. Um, in terms of the political rift, it's actually quite interesting because they ran together as allies in
yeah.
2022 inmates, Marcos Jr. as well as uh, Sara Duterte. And I largely think that the rift that has been forming is because of the grab, or at least because of the attempt to grab power. So I think a lot of these origins, or a lot of these is really because it's really an attempt to kind of consolidate alliances leading up to leading up to next year's elections.
Oh,
You know, I think it's a I think especially since at least after 2022, there came this assumption. They ran together because, of course, it was a way to consolidate power against the opposition, to ensure, let's say, that there would be no such thing as a Robredo win. But now that they're the incumbents, I think that you start to see these kind of gaps forming, or these sorts of rifts forming, in order to make sure that one party, whether that is Duterte or Marcos, can stay in power leading up to the 2025 elections, and
yeah.
even beyond that, 2028 elections, because after Marcos, or after Marcos Jr., the question is, who's going to be the next president, right? Will
Yeah.
it be Duterte? Will it be another Marcos, or somebody else entirely?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah. So it's sort of like a marriage of convenience in a way. Okay.
Definitely, I do think that it was definitely a marriage of convenience back then. The unity messaging that they used back in 2022 was, I
Mhm.
think, particularly strategic because it came as a response to what seemed like infighting on the side of the opposition, especially since the opposition at the time couldn't really get its heads together. Like former President Lenny Robredo was trying to organize, but then there were groups of people that would not back down. So you'd have a lot of um you'd have a lot. So there were really lots of contenders for the 2022 elections. Plus
Yeah,
the fact that I think part of the branding, or part of the branding, unfortunately, of the opposition, is really, it really feels the echoes, or kind of the negative consequences of what of something that seems divisive, right?
yeah,
There is this notion that, they're very critical, they're very divisive. So I think that 2022 messaging of unity really was a, a way to kind of respond to that, right? So in the face of, people of infighting, you choose unity. But
yeah.
now that, now that that's over, now that they've already installed themselves in the uh formal confines of power, I guess that's over. I guess it's time to, I guess all bets are off, or all the gloves are off now.
Okay. Is Duterte, I've been reading that Duterte is worried about the ICC. Is that an issue that divides them, or is that because I heard that part of the thing was just that Marcos would protect them from that, right? Is that true, or is that was that I'm not
I
really
mean,
sure.
there has been, what do you call this? There has been, I find Marcos Jr.'s human rights, track record quite confusing, to say the least. I
Yeah,
think, on the surface level, he did say that, let's say on the surface level, Marcos does present himself as very, he presents himself more differently in comparison to the older Duterte,
yeah,
right? In comparison to Rodrigo Duterte. President Marcos has publicly said that, there will be a new phase on the face of the war on drugs, but he has not really, passed decisive legislation, let's say, to prevent, the, uh, anti-drug raids and operations, and which really serve as the basis for police to continue, unlawful killings. But,
yeah,
um, the ICC probe, for example, President Marcos has denounced actually the ICC investigation, but, um, what do you call this? But we're not sure, because he hasn't really made use of strong language to say that he will condemn it, right?
yeah,
So I mean, that gives hope for those people, that gives
yeah.
hope for human rights defenders, but at the same time, I think he's been very, strategic in, um making sure to not make any strong pronouncements, uh, for or against it. So
Oh,
I hope, but I wouldn't say that it's because Marcos Jr. rather himself has a strong, um, proclivity or concern for human rights.
okay. That was going to be one of my questions, but I guess to continue that and stuff. So is Marcos just basically Duterte without the profanity, I guess. Would that be a good way of describing that or no?
Um, I would say that Marcos has attempted to kind of portray himself as a technocrat. Um, in comparison, I think, to Duterte, I wouldn't say that it's accurate to say he's Duterte without the profanity, because he's made a lot of strides to differentiate himself from Duterte. So, for
Yeah.
example, he fashions himself a technocrat by installing, qualified, technocrats into some government agencies. For
Oh,
example, his foreign policy has actually shifted away from, in contrast perhaps to to Duterte's, proclivity towards China. Um, Marcos
yeah.
has actually moved closer to the U.S. And Japan, so more closer towards the Philippines' traditional security allies. So his foreign policy pronouncements are quite different, and I think, he has tried to, I think one of the biggest changes, or one of the biggest, differences that Marcos has, done to kind of set himself apart from the Duterte administration, is the freedom, or that under his administration, Laila de Lima was actually set free,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So
I was going to ask about that.
Duterte administration, um, she was unjustly detained. She was unjustly imprisoned for years under false charges. But under the, Marcos administration, she was set free. So those are, little kinds of action. There are small actions that would indicate, otherwise, or at least that would indicate an attempt to differentiate himself from his predecessor. But of course, I will say that I feel that they are largely the same in that they're very self-interested, and of course, they still hail from the same cut of cloth, which is the same elite families, small circle of elite families that position themselves in power.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious. Something just popped in my mind. In terms of the press, has it gotten because are there still charges against Maria Ressa or and does ABS-CBN have a chance of getting its franchise back, or is that still up in the air?
If I'm not mistaken, I do think that there have been movement towards dropping the cases against Maria Ressa.
Okay.
I don't think that explicit, at least institutionally, I do think that there has been space for the press to be free under the Marcos administration,
Okay.
and that at least formally, because I think as of last year there were cases, uh, the cases filed against Maria Ressa, some of them were dropped. She was acquitted of some tax evasion cases.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm not sure about the cyber libel cases that have been levied against her. Um, so I think on the surface level, I'm not sure actually if there has been movement on the ABS-CBN front, if let's say ABS-CBN will be open again. But actually what I think, or at least based on my observation, the key difference between Marcos and Duterte is that Marcos Jr. is really able to I don't know if it's necessarily him or perhaps his advisors, but the way that he positions himself is, you on the surface level it seems like things are okay. Like it
Okay.
doesn't seem like it's not like the previous administrations where every day you wake up and you hear that the president said something, that Duterte said something strange, that he said something uh some strange being an understatement, but
Yeah.
uh, you wake up and you hear that Duterte made some sort of ridiculous pronouncement. Marcos isn't like that. That's not to say he's a better speaker, but it's because I think he barely speaks in public. He doesn't really expose himself in that way.
Well,
And I think on the surface level, it makes it seem like everything is okay. It's
is it
easy
more
to,
normal, I guess? It's more normalization, I guess.
I suppose, yes. And
Okay.
on the media front, I would say that the issue uh isn't that, let's say, traditional media is being discredited or freedom of the press is being discredited, but there's really an active effort to kind of open spaces for, let's say, alternative forms of media. So for example, during the Marcos run, or at least his run was also dictated by exploring vloggers, micro vloggers as sources of information, as sources of um opinion, let's say, as opinion leaders. um and I think that that's important, not because I think that these vloggers should be kind of discredited, but rather because we should understand that there's a certain appeal to these more informal sources of information, because I think the Marcos and Duterte run, or the Marcos and Duterte win, Rodrigo Duterte and Marcos Jr. run, I think that really happens as a result of kind of it comes as a negative consequence of social stratification, the kind of demonization of yung masa, or the masses, right? Thinking that people are bobo, so, but these kinds of informal vloggers, these political vloggers, micro bloggers, they're able to speak to the realities of life. So for example, a lot of micro vloggers are actually overseas Filipino workers or OFWs. So they
Yeah.
talk about hardships of life, and I think that speaks to the reality of a lot of Filipinos who really just want to improve their lives. So, and what I'm trying to say is, really that what do you call this? It's not that, I think the attack becomes more subtle. The attack becomes more subtle and establishing really an us versus them mentality. That, let's
Well,
say, you're middle class. Well, your middle class and upper class will never be able to understand what it's like to, strive this hard for a better life.
yeah.
And you would want yourself to be mirrored in a candidate you would want yourself to be mirrored in a candidate who understands those concerns, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know anything about the vloggers and stuff. So, but are you saying that they're more populist and grassroots in their appeal, I guess? Is that what you
Yeah,
mean?
definitely. I mean, these
Okay.
types of populist leaders. I mean, Duterte, more so than Duterte was, I think, more outright than Marcos, because one of the challenges, of course, of Marcos Jr. is he definitely does not portray a masa image at all, right? He is from a very affluent family. He can't drop the allegations of him being he cannot drop his past and who his family is from. But I
Yeah.
think he's able to kind of operate using his brokers, so people
Yeah.
like vloggers, uh, and I think it's important to acknowledge those without necessarily saying that, okay, we should discredit that, because it's really, again, I really think it's the backdrop of that is that rising resentment between the middle class and the lower class.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, I'm curious. You touched upon this in your last answer, but one of the things I'm learning about, the prominence of the Marcos and Duterte families, it sort of points to an issue that I'm just starting to learn about, where a few wealthy families have a lot of political and economic dominance and stuff. You talked a little bit about it, but what are the historical roots behind it, and how does this dominance affect the Philippines?
Well, there are the historical roots of the issue of a small number of families. I think dates back to actually after the Spanish colonial period.
Yeah, yeah.
After the Spanish colonial period, when the Americans came into the Philippines, they started to sell the parcels of land that was previously owned by parishes, and uh, a lot of families, a lot of them were Chinese immigrants, were able to purchase these tracts of land in order to turn that into agricultural land. And that therefore there you have, the beginnings of the haciendas, the beginnings of essentially what uh Benedict Anderson would describe as caciques. Benedict Anderson, who is a what do you call this, a social scientist, would
Oh,
actually describe the Philippines as a cacique democracy, wherein really that because of that historical context and because of the accumulation of land, it has really expanded into not just the accumulation of land for productive, but also access to power. It's these elite families that have had historical access to power because of how affluent they are. So from the post Spanish colonization up until today, you'll actually see that a lot of the families are the same. So for example, the Cocoangcos,
yeah,
Lopez's,
yeah.
right? So, and I think I mean, it's a long story. It's a long, you can read it, but simply put, that's just to say that you can trace a lot of the power, I think, a lot of political power to the ownership of land back in the day. And although there have been shifts, of course, there are new elite families, such as the newer elite families, such as the Dutertes, such as perhaps this the emerging Tulfo clan, right? The Tulfo brothers. But I think the impact of the dominance of these wealthy families in the Philippines is, of course, that democracy is controlled by an elite few people. And before, there was this assumption, so, well, if you allow me to touch into some political science theory. So before, there was this assumption that there would be a sort of exchange, right? A patron client relationship. That was one of the um more classical ways of interpreting the Philippine politics, wherein essentially the elite, in exchange for the support of the clients, would give land benefits in exchange for political support. But what we observe today is actually a little more insidious. What we observe is a democracy where power is essentially co-opted by elite families at the expense of people, at the expense of Filipino people. There's actually no benefit that reaches the masses, the poor, even the middle class, because power is really concentrated in these spaces of power.
Is that why leftists are so interested in land reform? Because if power comes from the possession of land, because I talked to a few Filipino leftists, and they say that they're always emphasizing land reform and stuff. Is that why and stuff? Is that the hope is that if if the poor people get land and stuff, it would help ease the economic inequalities? That's my theory of what why they're getting at that. Is that true or?
That definitely, I think that's one, at least from the perspective of, well, I can't obviously speak from the perspective of leftist activists, but I think that's definitely one. Part of it, of course, is also justice, because, for example, in Mindanao, a lot of the indigenous groups there were really subject to settler colonialism, so they were essentially there prior to anyone being there.
Yeah.
But because of, let's say, the American colonization, the Marcos senior administration, Christian settler farmers were moved to Mindanao to kind of decongest other areas of the Philippines, forcing, let's say, these indigenous groups of people out. So part of land reform is also justice for marginalized groups of people who have lived there for ages. It's also, of course, justice for the people who have worked on the land, right? In order to to develop the land into farming land, at the expense of, and you who expend their bodies, all for the profit of a few people, so that profit does not actually go to them. So I think that those are part of the uh, objectives of land reform.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. I was just curious and stuff. I think I have a very superficial view of land reform. That's why I'm talking to you because as a political cartoonist, it's important for me to talk to people who know more than me. So thank you for that and stuff. That's a good explanation and stuff. So um, I'm curious. We have 7 minutes left for this first video. So I'm wondering if well, let me ask this and stuff. And if we don't have, if your answer goes over, we can the second video we can talk about it. But um, you also, you mentioned this about the indigenous people, and you study them, right? What are some issues that they're facing right now?
A lot of the, what do you call this, a lot of some of the issues that indigenous people, um, what do you call this, face right now, of course, is development aggression. So
Okay.
issues like, for example, the Kaliwa Dam threaten the livelihood, existence and the homes of indigenous people. So these development projects, for example, which are supposedly intended for progress, essentially trample on the rights of indigenous people. So, for example, one of the issues, of course, is the consent. So, per the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, developers or any sort of development project is supposed to secure an FPIC, or free and prior informed consent, before building on ancestral domain. And a lot of the issues of these big development projects like the Kaliwa Dam put into question if this consent was actually sought. Because at
Um,
times, these development projects, when they are actually carried out, um, they tend to either consult somebody who is misrepresentative of the tribe that is actually residing on that land, and therefore the FPIC seems like it was given, but it was not actually given by the tribe there, or perhaps it was not given at all. So there are those issues, and I think indigenous people also face um, harassment and red tagging, especially in terms of Lumad schools. So, for example, a lot of activists who teach in Lumad schools, a lot of students themselves have also faced state persecution as well, uh, because of the assumption that they are tied to communists, or because of the assumption that they are
yeah.
dangerous. And of course, I think indigenous people also face the erosion of their culture, their language. I mean, tied together with development aggression, right? They're forced to move down. Let's say if they are in the mountains, they're forced to move downwards because of uh, the lack of support for their livelihood as well.
Okay. I've heard that mining affects them a lot and stuff, and that it pollutes the land that they're in. Is that true or?
Yes, there are issues as well of because in pursuit, let's say, of building mines, that also displaces indigenous people. And to be clear, of course, there are some indigenous tribes that practice, I think, small scale mining, but it's safe, or at least they do so in consideration of the environment. But these large scale mining projects don't just damage the environment, but also displace the people who live off of it and benefit from it as well.
Yeah. Was Gina Lopez's term as I forgot what it was, the environmental office when she was there, was that brief period of time helpful and stuff? Wasn't she at the beginning of Duterte's term?
Definitely, she was very strong. She was very strongly against these open pit mines, and she did try to let's what do you call it, she did I believe attempt to establish consultations between the government and indigenous groups against open pit mining. However, I think, of course, the she did pass away
Yeah.
untimely, so of course that was not it
A
was short.
very brief time. Yeah. Okay. Well, welcome back. Go ahead. Do you have something to say?
Yeah, before we get to the next question, if it's okay, I did a bit of research, but just to fact check myself, I
Oh,
believe I misspoke earlier in my definition of land reform. So
oh,
when you speak about land reform, it's specifically towards the relationship between farmers and landowners.
oh,
But of course, there is still a significant relationship between, let's say, indigenous people who lost their land, who had their land grabbed from them as a result of course, militarization, mining, and of course the historical roots of settler colonialism. So they did lose ancestral lands, but I believe their call is more towards self-determination rather than specifically the term land reform. But
oh.
anyway, I just wanted to clarify that
Oh,
to
no,
make
no,
sure.
thank you. Thank you for doing that. So when they're looking at land reform, it's for self-sufficiency because I think is it because when you're landless, you're at the mercy of the people who hire you. But if you have land, I guess is that what their goal is?
Yeah, and of course it's to dignify the existence of farmers, to enhance their living conditions, because oftentimes they're the ones again who are working day in day out, but the profit always goes to the landowners.
Oh, okay, okay. So land reform is still a work in process right now.
Yes, definitely. There have been some legislation, but decisive action to kind of support those legislations has not been seen, and which is why a lot of farmers, a lot of activists are still calling for land reform.
Okay. Well, I wish them luck and stuff. So, okay. Now, a few months ago, I was hearing a lot about charter change and
Mhm.
stuff. Could you tell me I mean, what exactly is charter change? Is that still a debate right now, or
In recent discussions, I think the at least in the recent news, conversations on charter change have died down. But under the Marcos administration, well, of course, the reason why, um, so charter change has had a long history. So Chacha, as early as I think during the Ramos administration, there was an attempt to change the charter to allow for more economic
oh,
senatorial system.
oh,
Um, to kind of
I
fix
think you
that.
froze. I think you
Oh,
froze. So I think part of what you said I didn't catch.
sure, sure. So I'll repeat it. So, have been several attempts to amend the 1987 Constitution. So there was under the RAF system to kind of adjust, or at least to get rid of the gridlock that is usually uh it's prone in this sort of bicameral kind of system. So there was an attempt to shift it to a federal type of system, but it was not really there was also an attempt, and that was the attempt to do that was through a people's initiative for reforms. There was a people's campaign, but eventually this was dismissed by the Supreme Court. There
Oh,
was also an attempt under the Estrada administration and the Arroyo administration. So a lot of these broadly have been, or at least a lot of the rationale on charter change um has been focused on supposedly amending the restrictive provisions in the Constitution against restrictive economic provisions. So for example, there's a limit to foreign ownership of corporations. And of course, that kind of impedes the entry of more foreign investments in the country. So that was one of the rationales under the Estrada administration. Um, and similarly, during the Arroyo administration, economic liberalization was the goal. But of course, the backdrop of that was also the concern that amending the constitution would also lead to perhaps the lifting of term limits for officials, which is something, of course, that we have. Coming from the experience of Marcos Senior, it's something that people are particularly wary of,
yeah.
and of course, even let's say the entry of even economic liberalization is still, I would still is still very much couched within, it's still very much for the benefit of local elites, because it's these elites who are, they broker these kinds of partnerships as well. So maybe moving forward, at least fast forward to the fast forward to the Marcos Jr. administration, charter change became a particular issue again, because of I remember uh, there was this commercial ad that started to play on that was playing, I think, on TV, and the messaging was EDSA Puera, talking about how the failures of EDSA for to produce jobs, the failures of EDSA to produce um educational reform, um, and that kind of set the tone for this conversation on uh, charter change. And in fact, there was actually a signature campaign, I think early this year, that was supposedly going around, where allegedly, certain politicians were offering money in exchange for people's signatures on the people's campaign. And again, a lot of the rationale for charter change, especially under this current administration, is economic charter change, which removes the 40% foreign ownership limit for public utilities, education, and advertising firms. Um, and the Philippine the Committee on Constitutional Amendments, I believe, actually approved it on the third and final reading. But the question, I think, is if this will actually pass in the Senate, because supposedly the Senate is will likely reject the passage of this bill. So right now, I think there's an impasse between the Senate and the House in the passing of this economic charter change. Now,
Oh,
yeah.
okay. No, I'm just wondering because usually, isn't it with a new president? They have a lot of supporters in Congress. Was this true with Marcos? Because I know when Duterte came into power, he had a lot of supporters that dominated the Congress, right? Is that true with Marcos or no?
Yes, for Duterte, definitely there was a formation of a super majority. And similarly to Marcos, you're finding similar patterns. A lot of the House is essentially allied, or that you have a lot of Marcos allies in the House of Representatives as well. Actually, I think last night or yesterday's committee hearing was one such show of how politicians have essentially, they really flip-flop depending, or they bandwagon, as a political scientist, Yuko Kasuya would call it. They really bandwagon, depending on the incumbent president. So for example, um, last night was the budget hearing of Vice President Sara Duterte. So in previous budget hearings, there were not a lot of questions cited, particularly against the confidential funds, which was a point of controversy.
Yeah, yeah,
In the last previous budget, her spending, I think, hundreds of millions of pesos in 11 days. So in this session of the budget hearing, and members of the House were actually starting to interpolate and raise those questions, in contrast to previous budget hearings when there were not all the questions were not as uh pointed towards understanding where these public funds come from. And I would say that I think that's reflective of the shifts in alliance. I mean, it's
yeah. I think you just
one.
paused again. Oh, sorry. I think you just paused again, so I didn't catch the last part of what you said. You were mentioning about how there were changing alliances, and now Sarah Duterte is being questioned more sharply than she was before and stuff, and that's because of the changing of alliances. I'm curious, was this when she was Secretary of Education? Is that the fund that you're talking about?
No, her fund for the office of the vice president itself,
Oh, okay, okay.
not even for her stint as the Secretary of Education. So, I mean, that's my suspicion that
Uh,
the sharp questioning is maybe a result of the shifting alliances, because prior to the shift in alliance, prior to this Marcos Duterte public rift, members of the House would not really question did not question the budget of the office of the vice president as, I think, as sharply as they did as last night. When, while it's good, it's a good thing that they are questioning the budget. At least I remain at a standpoint. I remain wary, simply because this is not the tune that a lot of traditional politicians or your travels were actually singing prior to this Marcos Duterte rift. So it's
uh,
good, but I mean, it feels very strategic, or it feels very calculated for me.
yeah, so it's not their integrity, it's just self-interest, political self-interest.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah. I'm curious. When Duterte, this is a question I didn't think that I didn't prepare for, but it just popped in my head. Was Duterte's version of charter change federalism, where they wanted to shift the power away from Manila towards the provinces and stuff? Is that still something that they're trying to do or no?
Right now, it's more towards economic
Okay.
interchange. But yes, one of the Duterte's campaign promises was federalism.
Okay. Did that die or
It it I think he ended his term with not a lot of this movement towards achieving that federalism.
okay. Okay. Was that I read that was because Manila has a lot of power and he wanted to spread that towards because he's from Mindanao, he wanted more power towards Mindanao, I guess. Is that right
I
or
mean,
am I wrong?
yes, that's definitely true. Of course, Manila, being the capital, it's also the concentration of economic resources and development is really in Manila. And I do agree that, and I think that's part of where a lot of the resentment does come from. That, of course, a lot of the progress is limited to Manila, for example,
Yeah.
and the promise with the Mindanao one, for example, such as Duterte being elected president, would be attention paid towards Visayas and Mindanao. So that was definitely, of course, the lure of that campaign promise.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, I was just curious and stuff. I heard about that in his early administration, but the conversation seemed to disappear. So I was always
Yeah,
curious to know where that went and stuff. So
yeah. It definitely did die down towards the end of his term,
uh,
perhaps owing to COVID-19, the COVID-19, but also I think because um there was there were a lot of studies conducted on how much it would cost billions if federalism was implemented. So maybe that's part of the part of the lack of decisive action towards
Oh,
federalism.
okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. My next question. How has the rivalry between China and the United States affected the Philippines?
Well, definitely because the Philippines is one of the strategic partners of the United States. It would seem that, I mean, their historically, of course, there has been, as great powers, the People's Republic of China and the United States, I think, have been trying to secure their interests here in the Indo-Pacific, right? There are concerns, at least making sure that they have uh they have their all of their interests aligned in the Indo-Pacific. So the PRC, for example, has been courting Indonesia, Cambodia, countries in the ASEAN as well. Um, and of course, um, the Chinese, the PRC strategy has largely been economic and in terms of military force. While the United States has, has focused more on, of course, security partnerships as well. But I think the United States has the advantage of, I think, having a more being a more palatable partner, perhaps in comparison to the People's Republic of China, who, of course, because of aggressive claims in their aggressive claims in the West Philippine Sea, as well as their aggressive claims over the Nine Dash Line. A lot of Southeast Asian countries or countries, part of the Indo-Pacific, are less likely to want to partner with them.
Yeah.
Um, Now, where the Philippines is a kind of position there is, interestingly, during the Duterte administration, you actually saw a shift towards China, as the Duterte administration was seen as um being very, very highly favorable to China. But right now, with the Marcos administration, you actually see a shift away from China. In fact, Chinese aggression in the West Philippine Sea, you have m- incidents reported, which really raise concerns for the livelihood of fisher folk, the safety, of course, of Philippine people. So it's definitely a flashpoint, and the United States being one of the Philippines' security partners, as well as, of course, the security umbrella of the United States, which includes Japan, of course. The Philippines has been trying, I think, to secure those partnerships. I
Yeah.
believe last month, or last April, sorry, the Marcos administration announced a trilateral security partnership with Japan and the United States to secure, the interests in the Indo-Pacific. So
Uh,
I would assess that, of course, um the Philippines is, in relation to these great powers, it has to kind of play its cards well, because that
yeah.
realistically, the Philippines cannot completely forego a partnership with China. I don't think any country can, because of how vast its economic power is, right? Everybody has to deal with China in some way or form. But in terms of its security interests, of course, it's currently very much aligned, for better or for worse. It's currently aligned with the United States, because it wants to protect its interest in the West Philippine Sea. But I will say that this interest is quite what do you call this interest is quite uh
Oh,
this partnership with the United States is also still very dependent on the results of the administration. So, for
oh,
example, as you know, there will be an upcoming election there. So we're not sure if a Trump administration, if you have another Trump presidency, if if that same kind of concern over the Philippines and the Indo-Pacific would actually carry over. So I think the challenge for the Philippines with any administration is to try to establish an independent foreign policy, free of reliance on these kinds of these major security partners.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I'm sorry about the phone. Did you
No,
hear the
no,
phone
no,
in the background? Oh, okay,
no
good.
problem. I think I
Yeah,
also had a phone call earlier, so I was
yeah. That's my wife and stuff. I'll call her later and stuff. But
no problem.
yeah, thank you and stuff. I'm wondering, with that, with is the Alice, is it Alice Gao? Alice Gao,
Alice
the
Go.
go, yeah, the mayor and stuff. Is that a part, a flashpoint in the Chinese Philippine relations? That's sort of a sore spot right now. I haven't followed it very well, but
I would say that well, I don't know if this is my maybe I'm what do you call this? My I don't know if I'm alone in this kind of thinking, but I actually feel like the Alice Go issue, well, of course it's still definitely an issue. It's been, I think the undercurrent of that is really the issue of offshore gaming operators or your pogos in the Philippines, which
okay.
are essentially ways by which money is funneled out of it's essentially these unsanctioned service providers in the Philippines, which um resulted in tax exemptions,
Oh,
um, a lot of visas without permit, which of course threatened kind of and illegal gambling, of course, which threatened the Philippine economy as well. So I think this Alice Guo issue that's the backdrop of that there are people who are not there are people who are not Filipino nationals who are posing as Filipino nationals to allow for the entry of these pogos into the Philippines.
mm,
Um, so at least personally for me, the issue that gets for all the soap opera and for all the concern that there is this fake person living in there's this fake
mm.
Filipino national who actually won as president. I think the issue that needs to be focused on is what that means, which is that there are people who are allowing the entry of these pogos who are illegal.
I hope you don't mind. I'm going to have to answer this call and stuff.
Sure,
But
no
here,
problem.
let me just pause this. For the South, for the West Philippine Sea, it's mostly because they want the fishing and the mineral deposits there and stuff. So, because I know Vietnam, um, Japan all have a similar problem, right?
Mm.
Is the problems of the of Chinese incursions there bringing Vietnam, Japan, the Philippines, I guess Malaysia, are they bringing them closer because all of them are having their water territory incurred on by the Chinese?
I think the Japanese also have a separate kind of territorial dispute. I think in the Senkaku Islands
Oh, okay.
with China. But of course, the issue of the West Philippine Sea and kind of the what do you call this? Uh what do you call the issue of the Chinese or the nine dash line encroaching on other countries. It does, for example, Vietnam is one of the claimants as well.
Yeah.
So of course it calls on the interest of other Southeast Asian countries.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you. Okay. Well, good luck. Good luck on that and stuff. I'm hoping for the best. Does it scare you when you see what happened in Hong Kong and then what's happening in Taiwan right now? Does it scare are the Philippines worried after what happened in those two countries?
Um, I, I can't say for sure. I mean, I definitely think there is a lot of panic over, let's say, um, I would say actually that this is just maybe perhaps an unqualified opinion,
Well,
but I would say that a lot of the concern stems more culturally, which borders, I think, xenophobia. For example, there's a lot
uh,
of panic over Chinese individuals, like for example, Alice Guo, rather than let's say the threat of the physical threat that perhaps the Chinese are, will the Chinese encroach, with the Chinese, for example, like for example in Taiwan, right? Whenever they have exercises in the air, there's nothing like that that's happened in the Philippines. But I think a lot of the fear is more cultural, or perhaps manifests in social, in the way people socialize with each other, which is also dangerous because again, it really obscures the threat, which is really the People's Republic of China, the Chinese government, and not, Chinese individuals,
Yeah.
which
So
is
it's
why,
more anti-Chinese racism.
yeah, perhaps anti-Chinese sentiment. I mean, the backdrop of that is of course fear, frustration coming from perhaps from the Duterte administration. But of course, there's a physical threat to the people who live near the area. So for example, for fisher folk who rely on that area near the West Philippine Sea to fish, there's a threat to their livelihood, a threat to their safety. But I think for the rest of the Philippines, I would say a lot of this, again, this is unqualified, and I'm happy to be corrected about this.
Okay.
I think a lot of the fear, a lot of the concern is more manifests more socially and culturally.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I'm just curious. I don't know the answer either. It was just a question that popped in my head and stuff. So okay. So I guess I'll just ask the last question and stuff. Um, for Ateneo de Manila University and other universities, how have they been affected by the Duterte and Marcos presidencies? Has there been any has academic freedom suffered during those times, or have you guys been relatively safe?
Um, I think that at least for the Ateneo de Manila University, I'd say that it exists within a bubble, in a sense that, excuse me, there's a lot of privilege, I think, that comes from being from a private university, myself being someone from the middle class. So I think that during the Duterte presidency, for example, I was a student back then, so I was a university student. There was that sense of fear of speaking out, particularly when, they were basically uh raising concern over activists. But I speak from the perspective of knowing that, and I'm humbled by it, that there is a privilege that comes from coming from a space like Ateneo. Um,
Okay.
speaking from, let's say, myself as an educator based in this school is not the same experience as somebody who is based, let's say, outside of that bubble, or somebody who doesn't come from the middle class as well. That
Okay.
said, I do think that universities such as Ateneo specifically, or perhaps the University of the Philippines, were still able to exercise their criticism or exercise academic freedom during the Duterte presidency specific. So I'll talk about it separately. They were able to exercise these criticisms, but I think they came at the expense or with some level of consequence that the general public, kind of deem these spaces as, uh, critics with no basis, right? So it became a kind of publicity war that, these, uh, these students from Ateneo are just criticizing the government without actually trying to help, or without
Um,
actually trying to work together with these forces. So there
is it
was
sort
that
of the
moment.
ivory tower thing that they
Kind of,
made the
kind of.
argument that they were a part of an ivory tower, I guess.
Yeah. And I would say that it's a valid criticism that a lot of these spaces are, of course, very insulated, or, not very, they can be quite insulated from the realities on the ground. And that was one of the criticisms against university students that, you know, protesting, let's say, against the Marcos burial during the Duterte administration. It seemed to a lot of people, let's say, who were supporters of the Duterte administration, it really seemed like we were the people, I include myself because I was one of those protesters, that we
Oh,
seemed like, we were just wasting our time, that we were just not aligning ourselves with the administration. That sentiment of ba't di na lang kayo makisama, is it was very prevalent. Um, During the Marcos presidency, I do think that there's a bit more academic freedom, in a sense that, again, it's similar to what I pointed out earlier, that it's not, I think, about outright decrying or outright vilifying spaces like universities, but rather working towards, a sort of cultural shift, or kind of shifting the way people think, so that these spaces are, you know subtly discredited. Like for example, the Marcos win again comes after a point where there's really a rising resentment between, let's say, these progressive forces versus, let's say, uh, it touches upon, populist sentiment, right? And to tell you honestly, it doesn't help that, some parts of the opposition were very uh, moralistic about their vote, right? This notion
Okay.
that, we are right, you are wrong, when
Um,
so that kind of divisive kind of politics, I think, has carried out. So while there is, of course, um still freedom for universities to speak out, to criticize, um and there's no outright prohibition of doing so. I think the worst incident that I saw was that a former undersecretary from the UP School of Economics, so she was quite, she was speaking upon economic reform. She was removed from her position unceremoniously. At least to my knowledge, I've never known anyone who's been told to step back in line. But the thing is, I think the question is, do universities find themselves relevant to the general public? Or is the general public still willing to listen to what universities have to say, because of how, perhaps deep this polarization is kind of, finding itself?
okay. I'm just wondering, so there's sort of a class issue there as well, isn't there? Because I'm assuming that a lot of the university students have the economic means to be in the university, right? You know,
Mm,
is a class a part of that too and stuff, or is it mostly just the ivory tower? I guess the ivory tower thing is a sort of class thing as well and stuff,
yeah,
but there is a sort of
definitely.
privilege there.
Definitely, there's a class issue. Although, to be clear, I mean, to be fair, I would say that I would say it's inaccurate to say that all students of, let's say, Ateneo de Manila University are from the middle class up. There are a lot of students who are from low income households. But I think it's the university and that kind of thinking vis-a-vis, let's say, the outside the university. So of course there's a class issue. For example, a lot of these conversations are they're not so in Filipino, there's this saying that, the language of rights, hindi naman yan umaabot sa bituka, right? Or it doesn't fill you, or it doesn't feed you. Talking about rights, talking about democracy isn't really something that feeds you. So there is that sort of gap. And if, let's say, universities or academic settings insist upon, let's say, speaking on the language of rights all the time, or at least speaking on the language of rights devoid of the context on the ground, that, rights are also, let's say, that rights aren't just social political rights but economic rights as well. So if there's that
Okay.
sort of gap in language, that gap in understanding, that's why these things emerge. But that's not to say that they're talking about different things. So, for example, um, Professor Mary Rosales, for example, in discussing human rights the from in urban poor communities, the framing shouldn't just be rights in terms of, your liberties, but rather, let's say, asking the community, the movement from, what they wish, or yung sana to dapat, which is it's something that they are beholden to.
So I guess you need to learn to listen as well as to educate. I read an article from Rappler um, mentioning you need to be able to speak to the jeepney driver as well as the student. Is that what you're saying? Or
Yeah, definitely.
okay,
That, the challenge, I think, for people in spaces such as the academe is to kind of question, um, you know, if the research or if the ideas that we produce, are they really relevant to people outside of our circles, especially if we want to try to engage our current political context. So, like you said, are the things that we're talking about, is that an open conversation with a jeepney driver? Is that, or is look no further than, the people that you interact with every day? Are you willing to have those conversations with, let's say, the tindera that you buy your breakfast from, or even, let's say, the janitors in school,
yeah.
right? So I mean, I feel very strongly about it, because I think a lot of these gaps in perception, or a lot of these divides, um they're nurtured by populist leaders such as Duterte and Marcos, this notion of an us versus them. And it doesn't help, of course, that some progressives, some people in power who want to reform are very moralistic. You know, that the
Yeah,
choice of
yeah,
Duterte was, you know, because they're bad people, or you choose Marcos because you're a bad person.
yeah.
It's not like that at all.
Yeah, I think also you need to it's sort of like the abstract artist had the same problem, like if a person doesn't understand abstract art, Hitler was able to demonize abstract artists or modernist artists and stuff.
Yeah.
So if you can't show how academia actually is beneficial to society and beneficial to everyone, it makes you more vulnerable to demonization.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And
Okay.
that notion of academia, and not just academia, but also, let's say, progressive values, being critical of democracy, it really makes you prone to seeming like you want to divide the people, or it makes you prone to seeming like you aren't for progress, because that notion of you just keep criticizing without
Yeah.
actually offering solutions.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a problem with the American left right now too. We lost touch of the working class, and we have to figure out some way of recapturing it and stuff, or the yeah and stuff. So, okay. Well, thank you very much. Did you have anything to add? We have about 3 minutes left and stuff, but
That's pretty much it. Well, thank you for the conversation. Actually, it gave me a lot to think about. Also, I even if I am in political science, I think it's important to continue to have conversations. The way I think now is really a product of interacting with different groups of people, and I think that we're in this mess.
even a cartoonist.
Yes, of course. There's this actually, there's this one of my favorite cartoonists who's based in the Philippines. His name is Tarantadong Kalbo. Um, he recently posted a comic that was something like, sa laban ng kadiliman at kasamaan, ang taong bayan ang talo, or something like that. And that's what I think of, at least, when you think about Duterte and Marcos, that really, uh at the end of the day, it's the people who lose. It's not about an either or of these two players, but rather, um making sure that we forward the interests of the people at the end of the day.